when you're off for the summer, your brain kind of shuts down a little bit, right? And then when it's time to get back to school, it's, time to open that up again. And so, risk and the issues that pop up, they usually don't come from, catastrophic failures. Usually it's the small things that slip through the cracks.
Well, hello and welcome to another episode of the Lightwell Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about school. As the summer break comes to a close, we want to talk about how do you have a great school year when it comes to considerations of insurance and risk management. And to do that, we're going to be speaking with Larry Clinton Sr. and Larry Matthew Clinton Jr., two gentlemen from the state of Wisconsin, president and agent of that agency respectively. They serve Lightwell there, and they've been serving schools and ministries for years in the state of Wisconsin, and they have some great insights on how to have a great school year. Let's get right into our conversation with Larry and Larry. Well, it is my pleasure to be joined by two of Wisconsin's finest Larrys, Larry Clinton Sr. and Larry Matthew Clinton, both working for Lightwell in the state of Wisconsin. Larry Sr. is the president. Larry Matthew is an agent for the agency. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining the Lightwell Podcast today.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks for having us. I was waiting for Tucker Carlson to invite me on his podcast or, maybe Sean Ryan, but, this is just as good being on.
No, it's
Adam
not.
Clark.
No, thank you. Thank you for that. That is an amazing way to respond to that. Well, you guys have been serving churches and ministries in the state of Wisconsin for a lot of years, and we appreciate your partnership in that, of course. But specifically today, we want to talk about schools, schools that do school as a ministry, and schools that are focused on Christian education as an environment. And here we are coming toward the end of summer, headed back into school when this podcast comes out. And we want to just open it up. And maybe there's a school administrator listening today. That would be the heart of this podcast. But as you see schools get ready to come back into fall session, what are some risk management considerations that you think are most important, or maybe even often fall through the cracks of preparation to get back into school?
Yeah, I'll take that one to start out. I really believe, once school gets up and running again, people are excited, that there's a lot of moving parts, with maybe new parents coming in and it's just a busy time. And, as they're preparing classrooms, hiring staff and getting everything, they go with the status quo and they forget about, revisiting some of their policies, some of the changes that need to be made. And I think that's where, Larry Matthew and myself and Jeff LaBelle, we have been trained to go in and become the risk manager for them, to help them to look at those policies and procedures and talk about it. And is there anything different from last year? So I think it's really important because it's easy to get to the status quo in starting a new year.
Yeah, that's right. Larry Matthew, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. When you're off for the summer, your brain kind of shuts down a little bit, right? And then when it's time to get back to school, it's, time to open that up again. And so, risk and the issues that pop up, they usually don't come from, catastrophic failures. Usually it's the small things that slip through the cracks. So it's really, like Larry said, paying attention to detail, refreshing your policies and procedures, getting your staff trained back up, communicating with parents. That's a huge one, especially as you have incoming families that may be new to the school, having them onboarded with your processes and what's expected of them makes for that smooth transition back into the school year.
Now, the property's there all year. Like, the property doesn't take the summer off, but when people come back into it, and you're starting to repopulate the school with staff during the end of summer and then students obviously getting back on campus, what are the liability things that come with people being in the school? Like I said, it's different than property. You have that risk year round, but what about the liability kind of considerations or exposures come with people being back in the halls?
That's absolutely right. Whenever our doors are open, and people are in our building, we have them in our care, custody, and control. We have a duty to make sure we have a safe environment for them. During the summer, you're going to have a lower exposure because there's not that presence of people. But when those doors are open and those students are coming in, as a ministry, of education, we have to be ready for that. Make sure our grounds are in, good shape. Our floors, there's no trip hazards. Everything's in working condition. So that those kids are in a safe environment, as free as hazards as possible.
Yeah, that's good. Anything you'd add, Larry Senior?
Yeah, I just think, the child protection policies, it's that document, but they really need to be reviewing those documents and, just not just setting them on their desk and, rescreening volunteers. I always look at it as, when a new school year starts, it's really an opportunity, for the school to take a fresh look at risk, rather than simply reviewing what they've done before. So it gives them that opportunity.
That's really good. Let me chase that down with a follow-up on exactly that. I think that with the new school year, new review, it could be even a chance to say, let's talk about the whole program, the insurance program from the very foundation. So if that were the case and an administrator is coming back into school, but also just looking at their insurance policy fresh, what are some of those core building blocks for a Christian school to make sure and have in place as they're building out their insurance plan? Where do they start?
That's a really, really good question, Adam. I think the best time is when us as agents have an opportunity to walk into the school and we get to see hands-on what the school is or may not be doing as just a prospect coming onto their property. We get to see their parking lot. We get to see the flow sometimes of cars coming in for pickup and drop off, the playground equipment. We get to see hey, do they have a sign in? Get a badge, sign out when we leave. There's a lot of things that we pick up on, just by putting hands on and being at the school level for a new school year. Are they dropping the ball? Are they, did they forget to put up their sign up sheet when we come in the door? Is the doors locked? It's really eye opening that we get to be that hands-on for them as their risk manager. When I sit down with an administrator from a school, I let them know that insurance shouldn't be the last line, or should be the last line of defense, not the first. So they really need to be carefully looking at their child abuse, molestation coverages, their cyber coverages, make sure their workers' comp coverages are in place with the right payrolls. So there's a lot of things that we need to do, to make sure that we have a good comprehensive policy, property and liability in place.
Definitely. Larry, Matthew, what would you say? What are some of those core building blocks for a school?
I always say every ministry's insurance program looks a little different, right? There's not a one-sized box that fits every Christian school, in the country. And so really it's the conversations that we have with the insured, with the ministry of, what are your concerns, first and foremost, so we can better understand, where they need to be, and transfer that risk into the insurance. Like Larry said, you have coverages, that's great. We hope that we never have to use them. We hope we can have a proactive approach in our risk management plan, so that we can prevent, injuries and accidents and unforeseen situations from ever occurring, but when we look at schools, the high risk exposures, like Larry said, with the unfortunate situations of abuse, molestation claims, you have your injuries, whether it's Johnny getting hurt on the playground or, our student athletes getting injured, in our sporting events, decisions that our board, our education board is making sure that they're properly covered. So there is a comprehensive number of coverages that need to be in a program to make sure that the ministry as a whole is properly protected, so they can do their work of educating the children and the youth in the ministry, and not have to worry about the insurance side of it.
You got right to the heart of it there at the end. One thing we talk about on the Lightwell podcast a lot is making sure that this piece, the insurance piece of their ministry, and in this case, the ministry as a space for education, is doing what it needs to do so you can focus on what you're actually called to do. So in the case of a school, that's educating kids in a safe environment where they can be fully themselves and not have to worry about all those insurance considerations. One of those is safety and security, the actual physical protection of students. And so that would be one, question I'd throw out. And Larry, Matthew, we'll start with you just to kind of keep bouncing it back and forth. But what are the core considerations when it comes to specifically safety and security for schools? It's such an unfortunate thing. They have to be so vigilant about this. But what are the things you talk about first when protecting schools for safety and security?
When it comes to safety and security, you could go, it's so broad and such a big topic. You have your extreme situations where, we have people that want to do, harm to our kids and, would come in active shooter type situations. So I think that's always in the back of everyone's mind of, how do we safeguard our schools against, situations like that? How do we make ourselves a harder target and not an easy target? What protocols and safety, can we put into place? And, outside of having armed tank security in front of every school, that we have to really be creative in how we can do it, because the cost of, security can be a big factor for a ministry. We don't have the budget sometimes to have, all the highest level of security that we can. So, communicating with our local law enforcement in those situations, getting training from them, having a good relationship with them helps. Having them out to your buildings to do walkthroughs, and using their expertise in that field is always something we recommend to our insureds. I think when I think of safety too, it's just our everyday interactions with kids. Recently, one of our schools, they were having some issues with safety of kids during pickup and drop off, just with parents, traveling in the parking lot, the drop off pickup lines, kids were, unfortunately almost got hit by a car. And so just having that communication and having those plans of, okay, this is our pickup procedures. These are our drop off procedures, communicating that with the parents, the teachers, our volunteers that are out there helping with those processes. Those are the little things that we can do on a daily basis to help protect our students in our schools.
That's some great stuff. Larry Sr., anything to add?
Really quickly, what I would add is one of the schools, a new prospect who I visited, I went in and said, hello, I'm going to be outside measuring your building. And I went with my wheel up on my shoulder, went behind the school. And before I know it, I saw kids going out the first floor window. And one waved to me. The next one said, intruder, intruder. And I thought, oh no, they forgot to tell the teacher. And I'm like, oh boy, this looks probably like a gun on my shoulder, my yellow wheel. And all of a sudden, 30 kids are going out this window. The teacher opens up the window a little further and she goes, hey, we're just practicing our intruder alert drill. And I said, thank you. But that's the whole thing. They're practicing what we're preaching so that they know what to do in a circumstance. I hope it never happens.
Of course. And one phrase that I've picked up on along the way in my work with Lightwell is that this idea that in a situation that demands the highest level of adrenaline, a panic situation, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to the level of your training. That is a dangerous and true prospect. And so it's, again, very heartbreaking and sad, but it's really good that they're training those kids to think, okay, when I need to go fast, when I need to do what I need to do, here's how I fall to the level of my training. I at least know what to do. That's a big deal. I'm glad they're doing that too. And I'm glad you weren't the problem this time, Larry. I appreciate that. Okay, so here's another consideration when coming back to school, there's often a new wave of technology. Everybody's getting new laptops or new, touch screens for the younger kids, or whatever it is. And that stuff needs to be insured as well. And also, protected from a cyber liability standpoint or other things. So there's lots of new technology or new equipment that gets brought in at the beginning of a school year. What are ways that schools can make sure that that stuff is taken care of in every respect by their insurance policy? Larry Sr., I'll start with you.
That's a really good question. I think it all boils down to is communication. Are they calling us as their risk manager and asking the question, hey, I got some new equipment. Do we need to add this to the policy? And typically we'll ask, what is the cost of this, and kind of see if they have enough in their policy, but also to have them document, what it is, the serial numbers, and put it on their asset sheet. So in case anything happens, it's going to make that process so much easier. And they really appreciate, when we give them sound advice as their risk manager. So that would be, my advice, to agents listening is, come in as the risk manager and have these administrators calling you. If they're calling you, you're doing your job.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Larry Matthew, what would you add? Anything?
Like you said, just documentation. When we have a claim, we had one of our ministries, it was a camp ministry, and their activities, building burnt to the ground, right? And so they have all their activity stuff in there, their canoes, their life jackets, their games, their bows, their arrows, you name it, it's in this building. And they didn't know, what they had in there, and how much, we have coverage on a policy, but you need to know what you have. That way the claims process can go smooth for you. You can get things replaced a lot easier. And so, with our schools, we're telling them, the electronics that you have, let's document them, get them on a spreadsheet, make an inventory of them. That way, what you have. If something goes missing, it's easily, you're able to find it easily. And if it's something that needs to be, taken care of with insurance, whether it's through your master policy, or maybe it's through a side policy you have with your, technology provider, like your Chromebook provider, you're able to do that quickly and easily. I guess the other side you mentioned too, Adam, was, the cyber liability side. And, we're seeing more and more of that as our technology continues to increase, the tech stacks that ministries have. We could be open to having those cyber attacks, and so how do we safeguard our ministry in those situations? We talk about, training our staff, because that's usually where I see the claims come through is, one of our staff gets an email in their inbox with a link, and they think it's something important. They click on it, and the next thing the cyber criminals are in the system and infiltrating everything and stealing information. So ongoing awareness, ongoing training with staff, that helps go a long way to prevent a lot of these cyber incidents from happening.
That's really good. That's really good. The documentation along with the, preparation for a cyber event. Would you also, just as a quick follow on, Larry Matthew, would you also say that there is a cyber risk related to personal identifiable information for students? Or is that less the case when it comes to schools because they're just, interacting with the software tools that the school says they can? Or is there still a risk there?
Yeah, I think it's a case by case basis. Anytime we have personable information, that we're keeping on hand, there's an exposure, right? And so something I always recommend too is talk with your technology providers. What information are they keeping? What information are you keeping? Who's responsible for it? What's their liability if they're breached with your people's information? If you have a contract with them, send it over. Let's look at it. Brotherhood Mutual has their free legal assist service. They'll look these things over and help ministries realize what their exposures are, and that's something that we as agents love to do for our insurers, is make sure, hey, the exposure, where you're covered, where the gaps may be, and we could fill those gaps as needed.
That's really good. Let's talk about staff and workers' compensation for a second. This is just kind of hitting on all the high point considerations of insurance for schools, workers' comp being one of them. There's a lot of variety in the type of staff that work at a Christian school. They're often this combination of ministry and educational institution where there are volunteers, there are seasonal staff along with full-time staff. How can a ministry-minded school take great care of its workers from a workers' comp perspective? And Larry Senior, I'll start with you.
I think it begins with training, and then training. I didn't know, but many workers' comp claims actually occur within an employer's first year of working at a school or a church because they're unfamiliar with the surroundings. They're unfamiliar with the policies and procedures, their lifting and their working environment, and they end up getting hurt as a result of not having the proper training. Here's a for instance. Had a pastor that stood on his desk and he thought he could change the light bulb in his office and he ended up slipping and falling. Was that his job to do that? That sounds like a maintenance job with a ladder and the right tools. So these are the things that we need to help them better understand to follow procedures and protocol for working conditions.
That's great. Larry Matthew, would you add anything to that?
Yeah, that's spot on. I mean, training, it starts with the onboarding of our employees from the get-go, setting that tone early, expectations, job safety, just so they know. They don't want to get injured, right? We don't want them injured. Nobody wants to get hurt. No one wants to go to the doctor, have medical bills, all that comes with it. So if we can start that training early on, I think that's exactly right. That's going to help prevent injuries in the long run and help our work comp claims.
So documentation from the side of the employer to know exactly who's doing what employees are responsible for what things, and then training for those employees to say, this is what you're responsible for, and this is what you're not responsible for, so they don't work outside of the bounds of the scope of their responsibility and cause any issues that way. Those are good notes. Some of the things that make school the most fun for kids isn't what happens in the classroom. It's those extracurriculars. It's the things that keep them after school. It's the sports or the plays or the band practices, the activities that really tether a kid to the joy of school. But we've talked about this a bunch on the Lightwell podcast. Every passion area for your ministry has a risk waiting in the wings. And the same is true for schools. Every time they're like, let's get a sports team going. Let's have a football team. Let's have a tennis team. Those things also come with risks. So as you're talking about extracurriculars with schools, and Larry Matthew, I'll start with you. What are some of those important risk considerations that they may not think of because it's not the normal everyday activities of schools? How do you help them prepare well for extracurriculars?
Yeah, that's so important, Adam. I think we always do well in our normal setting, right? We're creatures of habits. We like routine. Once you get outside of that routine is where things can infiltrate those cracks, right? And so when we're doing, after school programs and we have our sports events, unfortunately, a lot of times that's where we see claims arise, especially if it comes from, abuse claims, things like that, because we're outside of our normal routine, outside of our normal policies, our normal procedures that we would follow. And so when we're doing these things, it's important that we maintain the standards that we would for our everyday activities, right? Have proper supervision, have the right number of people involved, so there's no unobservable one-on-ones between adults and youth, and that's where the claims seem to happen. So I would say my biggest takeaway is continue to maintain those standards that we put in place as a ministry, not only in our everyday classroom setting, but in our extracurricular settings as well.
Oh, that's very good. Larry Senior, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think, the written procedures, again, going down to, written procedures, participant waivers, all those things that are going to help us to help them, with their premium. When it comes to renewal, there's nothing worse than having, 5 extracurricular medical claims, and they go, well, why didn't you tell me there wasn't a waiver? As many of you know, Larry, Matthew, and I are basketball officials. So we know all about the extracurricular activities that go on at these high schools when we're reffing games. But I'll give you a real hands-on application. One of my schools out here in Wisconsin, the athletic director actually, before the game starts, brings the refs and the coaches in for a meeting and says, if we have an active shooter tonight, this is the protocol. If we have an injury tonight, here's the trainer. If we have weather conditions, these are the doors to the basement or wherever we're going to go. I mean, those are the things that, every school should be thinking about before it happens once again. So having written, procedures and protocols and meetings and communication is key. And when we bring that up in a risk management meeting with these business administrators, they're like, whoa, I've never heard this before. So it's important we communicate so they can communicate well.
That's really good. That's so important. It may feel like a drag. It may feel like such a bummer to have to start a game that way, but pulling the right people into a circle and saying, this is what we do if any of these things happen, that is some next level real-time risk management stuff that I hope administrators are paying attention to, because that's free. That stuff, it doesn't take any, you know what I mean? It doesn't take any additional money. It doesn't take a huge meeting or a bunch of signed waivers. It's like, just get the right people together and say, this is how we're going to handle things tonight. I love that. So, you brought up something at the end that really, we're getting down to the end of our time together, and I really do appreciate both of you giving your time today. But you mentioned just like asking a risk manager the right questions, or making sure that you just have those right policies and procedures in place. And that's really where the two of you and our Lightwell folks across the country come in. And so this is not a Lightwell insurance commercial, but what this is I'd love to set up for you guys the chance to explain why it's important to work with someone who understands the unique needs of a Christian school. And so if you were to sit down with a school leader to help them prepare, what are the things that make a difference when working with an agent who really understands the unique needs of a Christian school? Larry Sr., I'll start with you.
I think the one thing that I really enjoy is asking a administrator is, if an incident were to occur tomorrow, would you be confident, very confident, that your policies, your procedures, and people are prepared to respond? And if he can't answer that question with confidence, then I need to do a better job, or I need to inform him how he can feel confident, put his head on his pillow at night, however you want to phrase it. But, our job is to allow him to do his work, and so we can, make him shine. It's not his job. I'll give you a perfect quick example. I had a pastor call me. I got new boilers. The state is on all over me. And I said, well, didn't he teach you that in, seminary? And he goes, no. He goes, that's why you have me. I said, I'll get it taken care of. That's why they hire us.
That answer brings me a lot of joy, because that comes down to what we said earlier, the simplicity of when these pastors go to seminary, when they go to Bible college, they may come out and be able to read the whole scripture in Hebrew and Greek, but not know that budgeting and risk management is also going to be a part of their job. And that's tough, man. That is the reality of operating in ministries. You also have to be administratively minded. But when you bring the right partner alongside you, it lowers that burden of your responsibilities, so you can actually focus on your calling. You can focus on the things you've been trained on and care about the most. I love that. So Larry, Matthew, what would you say to that? What are the things that make it important to work with a church and ministry specialist when talking about insurance for schools?
It's not just selling another policy, right? I don't get the satisfaction, the joy, the fulfillment, if you will, of going in and just selling a packet of paper of promises, right? What I always tell my insureds is, you're hiring me as a member of your team, okay? So I don't take up office space here in the building, but I'm always a phone call, a text message, an email away. When you have concerns, when you have questions, we're your first point of contact. We're here for you. We're here to serve you. And being a ministry specialist, we see the claims that are happening, not only, here in Wisconsin, but we have conversations with the claims adjusters from Brotherhood. So we're looking at a nationwide, exposure of claims. And so when we see these claims and these incidents that are affecting our ministries, we're taking these back to our insureds and having those conversations of, X, Y, and Z happened over here. Are you guys prepared to handle something similar? What do you have in place? And walk through those processes with them to help better protect them. So having a comprehensive view of ministries growing up, going to Christian school, I know what it's like to go through the ranks through the years. And so that gives us the ability to communicate properly and be on the same, page as our ministries, so we could help them better serve those that they're dealing with.
That is so good. And it actually sets up my last question for both of you. So Larry, Matthew, I will start with you on this. This is something that we're asking everybody on the podcast this year, because you just said it. And so it's okay if you're going to be redundant with this, but this is not just a sales job for you. That is not where the fulfillment comes from. So let me just ask, what inspires you to keep going through the work that you're doing for Christian schools and Christian ministries all the time? What do you see that inspires you to keep going?
It's really that, is being able to help these ministries, and you see the light click sometimes when, you're able to bring them something that's able to make their job as an administrator a little bit easier, and better protect the ministry. The other thing I love is I just go on, Facebook or socials, and, looking at videos of the things that our ministries are able to do, right? The programs, the outreaches, and they're able to focus on that, like we've, talked about, and not have to worry, about the insurance side of it and the risk management, because they know they have a partner who's got their backs, on that side of it. So the end fulfillment for me is, really the ability for them to minister and see people's lives change. When we hear a testimony of, someone that went to one of our camps that came to know the Lord, because they went to camp and they met Jesus there. That's awesome, right? They don't know anything about risk management or insurance. They came there and they were able to have their lives changed. And at the end of the day, I think that's what it's all about. So
I agree. I think that's extremely well said. Thank you for that. Larry Sr., bring us home. Same question to you.
Our tagline, our ministry is to protect yours. It's a ministry. Whenever I hire anyone, I let them know that this is ministry. We're insurance ministry. And, they're going to call us most of the time when they're going through a difficult time, a sexual misconduct claim. And to be able to come along their side and serve them and pray over them is just one of the best things about this job, is to be there when they need you most. And, that gives them hope, that, they got someone praying for their wisdom. There's a fear that's going on when they call with these claims, and they need to know that like Larry said, they didn't just buy a piece of paper, but they bought a risk manager who's going to be there and answer the phone when needed most. So we're there, and we really do Colossians 3:23. whatever we do, we work heartedly. It's with our heart. It has to be for the Lord and not for men. So we put the Lord first.
I know that that's true. I know you both well enough to know that what you just said is not lip service to some sort of aspirational goal that's very different in the day-to-day. That is who the two of you are. And so it is my honor to have you on the podcast today, and also on behalf of the Christian schools and all the ministries that you two serve in the state of Wisconsin. I want to say thank you for staying in the work, for staying dedicated to the mission, and the things that you do every day to make sure that ministries can flourish and stay focused on their calling. And on behalf of the podcast, thank you both for joining me today. This has been a great conversation.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate you.
My thanks once again to Larry Clinton Sr. and Larry Matthew Clinton Jr. for their time today. Man, that was a great conversation, especially down at the end. I really do feel like there are people out there for your school or ministry who are just interested in you thriving. And Larry are a great example of that. And so my encouragement to you today, if you're a school administrator or maybe you're just a ministry leader who caught this episode of the podcast, is find someone in your area who can have that kind of conversation with you. And if you don't have a place to start, you can always start at lightwell.com. So until the next episode of the podcast, let's go and let it shine.